Welcome. My name is Palmer. I'm with Teradata. We're sponsoring the theater the next 2 days for the training session, so glad you're here. A couple of things to remember. Silence your phones, if you would. Okay. And then these sessions have CEU credits. We'll have a Q&A just after the presentation. And then in the back, we'll have a scanner for you to take to get your credits if we're doing that one, okay? I'll introduce John Haler. Good morning. Good morning. And with the Software Engineering Institute. So with that, I'll turn it over to you and enjoy your training.
Okay, good morning. Thanks for attending this first session. This is first of all, can everyone hear me okay? Can you hear me okay in the back? Good? Okay. So this is a fairly small group, so if you have any questions, we can sort of take questions as we go through the presentation. So these are our session topics. We're going to talk a little bit about foundations and background. So there's a few areas in here where I show data and some research. It's fairly lightweight, but some research we've done about supply chain practices in industry and critical infrastructure sectors. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where we get that data and how we get it. That's the foundations and background section. We'll talk a little bit about threats to cyber-dependent supply chains, a brief example. We'll talk a little bit about the role of contracts and contracting in supply chain risk management. Right? I'm not going to go into depth here. We could probably talk a day about that. But I just want to point out some limitations of really contracts, the way that these risks are normally managed, and some of those limitations. And then we'll talk about managing resilient supply chains, and we're really going to focus on protection of covered defense information and some of the recent modifications to the Deforest clause, because it's a hot topic and it's a great example of kind of dealing with diffuse and common supply chain and vendor risks across, let's say, an acquisition program or a weapon system program. Is everyone familiar with the recent changes to the DFARS and focusing on covered defense information? Is that, no? Okay, we'll go into that and I'll kind of explain what that's all about. These are our learning objectives. I'm not going to go through these in a great deal of depth. So foundation. So a lot of this work is based on the Cert resilience management model. So the resilience management model is basically, it's a 626-page book that, when you're trying to fall asleep at night, you can get from Amazon and read. But it goes into a great deal of depth about operational resilience for organizations. Kind of the structure and the heritage of this is based on CMM and CMMI, right? I would say CMM is its great-grandfather, so to speak. But it's really focused on security of operations and resilience within an organization. And it is also a maturity model, right? It's looking not only at what practices does an organization have, but also what do they do to make sure these practices are sticky, to make sure that in times of stress or incidents or even organizational change, that those practices stay in place. The definition of resilience kind of also tracks the definition from PPD 21. I'm also going to talk, this is the direct source of a lot of the data here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Cert Cyber Resilience Review. So the CRR is a project that we do in conjunction with the Department of Homeland Security, where we go out and we do assessments of critical infrastructure organizations in the U.S. Now, there's actually 400 total assessments in the database. Hi, Stacy. There's actually 400 total assessments in the database, but about 252 on the current version we have. Okay, and we'll go into a little bit more depth about what that is. So CRR, as I mentioned, it looks at critical infrastructure sectors in the U.S. I would mention that defense industrial base is also a critical infrastructure sector per DHS, and of the 252 assessments on version 2, we have exactly 2 defense industrial base organizations, okay? So if you work in part of the defense industrial base, in other words, a defense company or a defense contractor, and you're interested in this, please see me after, because it's not for any specific reasons that we don't have a lot of defense companies in here. It's more or less just a function of the project, really. But the key point is really is the second section here. Data is protected as PCII. It's protected critical infrastructure information, so that if we go out and it's free assessment, if we go out and we do the assessment, that data is entirely yours. It's not FOIAble, we can't give it to the DoD, it's protected as PCII. The only analysis we do is kind of at the anonymous level, and I'll sort of show you an example of that next. The things that we're looking at, the domains are on the right, everything from asset management, controls management, incident management, and external dependencies management. Now, we use this term external dependencies, it's in the title, because external dependencies, anytime you rely on an outside organization to support a critical mission or function, we look at that as an external dependency. Really, it's a catch-all phrase. It includes things like third-party risk management, supply chain risk management. We find that in a lot of organizations, people view this very narrowly. They might be in one silo. I think about software assurance, or I think about cloud service agreements, which makes a lot of sense. However, from the perspective of enterprise management, your organization probably relies on a lot of third parties, right? And sometimes it's really hard to get a handle on those. Like, we do a lot of work and assessment of the banking sector, where for a given service, they may rely on 1,000, 1,500 vendors to do something like account maintenance or to send you your statements on your credit card bill or whatever. And just to get a handle on those and sort of track them and prioritize them is very difficult. So we find that a lot of organizations would benefit from thinking about this problem more broadly. So just to give an example of the kind of research we've been doing with this, these are all critical infrastructure sectors. They're all sectors where we have 19 or more assessments. And what we're now starting to be able to do, we can't do it for the defense industrial base because we don't have enough assessments. We have 2, right? It's not even close to statistically significant. But what we're starting to be able to do is to compare critical infrastructure sectors on how they manage and sustain cybersecurity across these 10 domains. So if you look at, I'm not going to really go into like what each sector is. I will say that the thin gray line at the top, which in terms of, so basically the measure here is of all the practices across these domains, what's the percentage where these practices are fully performed, where the organization has a complete practice in place, and there's something like 200 practices in here for each of these domains. I will say the top green line is banking and finance, because the banking, I mean, you can speculate about the reasons, but moving data and trust and confidence is kind of part of their business. And frankly, they've also been highly regulated in this area for a long time. One of the other foundations here is the Nist Cybersecurity Framework. In the theater, how many folks are familiar with the Nist CSF or have looked at it a little bit? Some? Okay. Are any organizations starting to use it at all to kind of understand where what they're doing cybersecurity-wise? Kind of just looking at it, getting familiar with it. So CMU, we actually sponsored the first Nist CSF workshop. Okay. And all of our material is now starting to integrate with the CSF. Okay, so what that means is on version 3 of the Cyber Resilience Review, we always give folks a report. It's kind of like a heat map that shows what their organization does, and if they want to improve a certain practice, where they can go to get better at it, whether it's incident management or controls management or whatever it is. We now crosswalk to the Nist CSF, and on the new version of our assessment, we show you, okay, here's what you do with respect to the CSF, and here's how you can kind of get better at certain practices or certain processes if you want to. So generally, I'm not going to go into every example of supply chain risk because there's a lot, right? We generally break down sources of risk to actions of people, systems and technology failures, failed internal processes, and external events, right? So why does cyber risk happen? In a lot of our material, we really counsel that it's a good idea to have a broad perception or a way to think about risk so you're not pigeonholed, right? If you're trying to assess risk for your organization, far too many organizations, the risk they assess is whatever appeared in the newspaper the previous day and whatever their competitor is experiencing or, whatever was in the news. We're going to talk about a few specific examples. One is breach of covered defense information, controlled unclassified information. That's kind of the thing we talk about later in this presentation. There's many others. Actually, I'll just ask the room. When you all think about supply chain risks in your organization, what are the top 2 please feel free to raise your hand. What are the top 2 risks that you worry about in your organization? Nate, what do you guys, we were talking before, software assurance or? Yeah, vulnerabilities are all the things when you use a piece of technology, let's say in a weapon system program, what were all those requirements to build that piece of technology, and are they compatible with how I'm actually using it? So a fit for purpose test, right, is something that a lot of people think about in the supply chain. This is sort of more focused on contractor and service relationships rather than specifically hardware and software, but that's a great example of a risk. Kind of at the, let's see if I got a little pointer here, I guess I don't. Yeah. We also think about process failures. So what are the risks of not knowing where your sensitive information is, right? Not having good processes to understand where that information is, like let's say in a set of contractors and subcontractors. So as you think about this risk area, at kind of the higher maturity levels, you're not only assessing and identifying specific risks, nation-state risk or whatever it is, but also the risks of how you do that process within your organization. Yeah. Yeah, there you go. Great. So these are some commercial sector data breaches. I'm not going to go through each one, but really we're talking about billions of records, consumer records that have been breached and lost in these different incidents, right? The first $1 billion incident, quote unquote, was Target, which was a function of a contractor, where essentially the contractor was really the avenue of attack or a way into the organization, right? And I think there's kind of a lesson here, which is that these third-party relationships and contractor relationships, there's risk involved. We all have to use third parties generally, and the risks are sometimes surprising. It's not only them holding onto your data, it's also the possibility of a third party being the avenue of attack into your organization. So we're going to talk more deeply about Transcom and the series of breaches and basically foreign nation-state attacks that affected Transcom. All this is publicly available. The Senate Armed Services Committee report is available out on the web. How many folks are familiar with this incident or have heard about it? A couple? Okay. So it says the Senate Armed Services Committee. It's really law enforcement, identified 50 successful intrusions targeting Transcom contractors between 2012 and 2013. Many of these were attributed to advanced persistent threat, right? And just to give everyone an idea for folks that don't know, Transcom is a military transportation command. So they are responsible for setting up and running movement of military equipment and materials and assets in the continental United States, right? They don't have this capacity all internally. 80% of it is outsourced, right? There's 2 major programs, which are the Civil Reserve Air Fleet and the Maritime Sea Lift Agreement. And based on looking at the intrusions, those were kind of the targets, right? As a result of the 20 intrusions, this is a great example of information sharing, or unfortunately in this case, the lack of. This is right out of the Armed Services Committee report. One of them was known to Transcom. All of these others were known to other government sector agencies who were investigating or familiar with the incidents, right? After this event, or a series of events, there was a lot more attention paid to information sharing and how other parts of the government work in this respect. So this is, and it's kind of just reinforcing the point, right? This is actually from the 2013 Data Breach Investigations report that Verizon puts out. I don't know if everyone's familiar with that, but it is a great report they put out every year. It really gives you a good understanding of like attacks and how they work, right? It's the same story every year. I just use the 2013 report because it puts it in a nice chart. And what it kind of shows is where organizations pay a lot of attention and frequently put a lot of money, things like intrusion detection, incident response, and so forth, those account for an important but a fairly small percentage of the actual breach notifications, right? More of them are how you work with other parties and notification from other parties, whether those are industry peers, law enforcement, or how you do, now this is sort of financial focused, that fraud detection up here, but a lot of the breach notifications are from unrelated parties, and and relationships that your organizations may have, rather than, not that the technical measures are not important, like network monitoring, of course they are, but a lot of organizations underemphasize some of those other activities where you would actually be notified of breach. Go ahead. In ransomware cases, yes. Right, I can't speak to each and every, so the question just for the group was, perpetrator was up on the list, so when is the perpetrator notifying you of the breach? I don't know exactly what the composition of each of those incidents was, but in a case like ransomware, yeah, it's literally, hi, I'm from Russia, I'm from another nation state, I've encrypted all your data, pay me $50,000 if you want your data back, right, that type of thing. So this is also from the Data Breach Investigations Report. I just put this out there for kind of discussion. How many folks are actually deal with contractors with third parties? Like they're writing requirements, okay. So it says you can't outsource the risk and responsibility to a third party. So I'm educated as a lawyer. One of the things that contracts are for is to allocate risk. There are all sorts of examples in your daily life where you enter into a contract and you allocate risk. It doesn't always work out that well in cybersecurity, I think for a number of reasons. I think contracts can allocate risks, but there's a lot of caveats there, and we'll talk about a couple. So I wanted to provide this chart because we talk about the Transcom incident. In many ways, Transcom looks really good, honestly, because what they did was they did include very complete cybersecurity contracts in their third-party agreements, at least with respect to these particular suppliers, right? This is some data from the CRR, and it talks about, or it looks at, of the organizations we have assessed, what are their practices around third-party agreements? And you can kind of see that, does your organization document security objectives and agreements with third parties? Yeah, about half. Does your organization include measures of cybersecurity performance and agreements? Again, maybe about half. Now, where the organizations we studied are more likely to have more practices, right, is cybersecurity performance considered when selecting third parties? Most people, 68%, not most. The organizations we studied are more likely to do that. But then again, if you look in the lower left, do you monitor the third party's ongoing compliance? Again, maybe about half. But when you just think about all the things that Transcom put in their contracts, they went through a long process to get better at that and put those in the contracts. They did really well when you look at it this way. However, having the requirement in the contract is one thing. Sort of the care and feeding, in other words, service reviews with the contractor. Do they actually understand what's in that contract? Do they have the processes in place to fulfill the requirements and the things that you have in the contract is kind of a different matter. And I would really recommend the Senate Armed Services Committee report because it's kind of a great postmortem and a great explanation of what the contractors actually did with these contractual requirements, right? So kind of the top line here is the intention was that if an incident affected a system where there was information, Transcom wanted to know about it. For several of the contractors, the way that they interpreted that was, if we've confirmed that there was an exfiltration of information or that information was corrupted, then we'll report the incident, right? So I think that, I say the contract language is in the eye of the beholder. They're not always going to interpret it the way that you want them to interpret it. It's not for any bad intention. It's just that that's contract language. I mean, people look at it differently, and you look at how you satisfy your contract. The other thing is that there are a number of processes that have to be in place for something like that. Like, do you actually know where that information resides? And we'll talk about that. So contracts can do these things. They can allocate risk, define breach, and drive behavior. But if you're entering into these contractors in any industry sector, whether it's defense or healthcare, it doesn't matter, you have to sort of think about the bottom line here. How are we going to prove breach if we have to? How would we prove damages? And what remedies would we go to if they actually do breach or if we think they do, if they're breaching? So I'm going to just review kind of some of the changes to the Deforest language. This is Deforest section 252204, sort of the 7000 series. Was last revised on actually December 30th. That's actually a mistake on the slide. The objective here is to make sure that defense contractors and subcontractors are protecting controlled defense information. This is actually a new term. It includes things like controlled unclassified information, which is information that has technical details of systems, although it is not formally classified. One of the changes in this series of changes was that now it's no longer only information that DoD gives to a contractor, because that's a gap, right? It's also information that the contractor develops in performance of the contract, right? So it sort of doesn't make sense if you think about it to list out, well, these are the types of specific information, because as you have an engineering project, of course, you're generating additional information that needs to be protected. It's funny you should ask that. We're going to go into that in a second. Okay. What else do we want to say about the basic changes? So there have been a number of discussions around the changes to the Deforest clause. I don't know if anyone in the audience knows differently, but the latest change is that contractors have until December of 2017 to make these changes, and we'll talk about what adequate security means in a second. Okay, so this is adequate security. It's basically compliance or the implementation of the 109 controls in Nist Special Publication 800-171, okay? It's a good list. I mean, it's a PDF publication that you get for free online. There's 109 security controls. Essentially what Nist did was I assume everyone's familiar with 853. They looked at 853 and they had tailoring controls against 853, right? The tailoring controls were things like if it was a specific federal requirement, or typically federal, it was out. If it was a security control that typically protects availability rather than confidentiality, like typically business continuity and so forth, it was out. There was one other tailoring criteria. But essentially, they did winnow down 853, but it's still 109 controls. Now, I don't have the list up here. The controls vary greatly. Some of them are organizational processes, like do you have an incident response plan for covered defense information, right? Some of them are very granular, and they go down to the level of, are you monitoring things like the use of smart boards in your organization that may have CDI on it? So it varies kind of in an organization with respect to, is this an enterprise management thing, or is it a very detailed technical control? There's also a process in the law around, you can vary. You have to submit, at the start of the contract, you have to submit something to DoD CIO saying how you're varying it, then it becomes part of the contract. So application of controls, as I mentioned, it's highly relevant. It's a useful set of controls for protecting this information. As usual, Nist did a fantastic job on it. However, one of the things that you need to consider is, as time goes on, how an organization implements technology and uses it is going to change. Their own supplier relationships are going to change. So not all the controls will be equally applicable at the same time. It also does not evaluate certain practices across an enterprise to maintain those controls. In other words, if it's a point-in-time assessment of Nist controls, that may not necessarily provide assurance that those controls will be in place on an ongoing basis, right? How do you know that they're actually sticky? How do you know that those controls will be on the right technology over time so that they provide the same level of protection that they did at the start of a contract, right? It's kind of a hard problem. There's a section in the law in the Deforest that states there's a flow-down requirement, right? So if I'm signing a contract with DoD, I have to agree to a section in the Deforest. I also have to flow it down to my subcontractors. What the controls don't evaluate is, how do I select my subcontractors? And frankly, how do my subcontractors select what are their processes in place to actually have the right third parties and the right contractors in place? It really doesn't go into that. So kind of based on a resilience, that we're going to talk about an alternative or additional way to look at this. And so we think by having better enterprise management processes in place, it may be controversial, but a lot of organizations are not going to put all 109 controls in place. They just may not have the budget for that 109 controls, or if it's a small defense contractor where, let's say, DoD business is 5 to 10% of their total business, they may be hard-pressed to put all 109 controls in place, right? So we think that with better processes in place, with better enterprise processes in place, organizations can do a better, kind of more sustainable, sticky job of protecting something like covered defense information over time. But the way that you do that is understand and improve sort of the relevant processes to protecting the information. And I should say that this approach doesn't just apply to covered defense information or compliance with the Deforest clause. It applies to lots of problems. I'm just using Deforest as kind of an example because it's been a hot topic for a lot of folks. But by looking at what are the relevant processes in your organization, how do you improve those? Can you have a controls management capability in so that you're actually putting technical controls in and you know why you're putting technical controls in? If you have some objectives for those controls, it makes it a little bit easier to manage technical controls against those objectives and also to do gap assessment and effectiveness measurement. And finally, if you do enterprise governance around this, it results in a higher likelihood that the right practices will be in place. So these are just a few examples, right? And these don't appear specifically in either the DFARS or in Nist 800-171. So first of all, is the information identified and tracked? Is there really a process to make sure that somewhere a manager is actually tracking and understanding what covered defense information the organization has? Insider threat is probably, that actually is in the DFARS. But going above and beyond that a little bit, is it actually evaluated for effectiveness? When it comes to configuration and change management, it's good to have that process. A foundational thing here is, do you actually know what technology something like covered defense information is on or transiting so that you do the change management process on the right technology and detect incidents on the right technology? Incident management, risk management. So is there a formal risk management program around something like this? Even more specifically, if the organization has a formal risk management program for cybersecurity risk, does it include DFARS information, or does it include managing risks to information that, let's say, the DoD or that the government cares about, right? Because again, if it's a situation where, let's say, a contractor or business, 5 to 10% of their business is DoD, from the government perspective, you want to make sure they have a risk management process. They may have a risk management process that's highly mature and focused on the remaining 90% of their business. From a government perspective, you want to make sure that that includes covered defense information and some of the government concerns. And you may, signing the contract is maybe the first part of that. It doesn't mean that their risk management processes actually cover the government concern. So finally, controls management. I'll go into a little more depth here. Are there actual control objectives that support the confidentiality of CDI? So these are the types of things that you can kind of read them into the Nist publication and, frankly, the law itself, the DFARS clauses themselves. But if an organization has these, the more they have these explicit and these are understood as the objectives for controls. Now, this is a proposed set, right? This is just based on our experience and some of the assessment work we've done. But it's beneficial if you're a manager, for instance, at a contractor, and you're faced with this. The more these are documented and people understand why do we have these controls in place, what is the purpose, right? Not only covered defense information, but the organization's own internal information. Then you can start to do gap assessments and do management activities against those controls in a more rigorous, periodic fashion. And finally, governance. So having enterprise governance in place to protect this type of information, which again is something that these activities are not necessarily, they're expensive in the sense that it takes time and it takes staff time to do some of these activities. I would argue that they're less expensive than some technical solutions that are frequently offered. And once these processes are in place, they also pay dividends more in the long term, right? The next time you have a contractor or when technology changes, now you actually have processes in place that are hopefully those processes stay and are useful for a variety of different situations, right? The expense of security measures, of course, always comes up. And why do we focus on governance? Well, it's because governance matters, right? I mean, I think this is intuitive, but so to kind of explain this eye chart, this is looking at the external dependencies management domain in the CRR, right, where that's one section of the cyber resilience review, and we went out and in these 252 organizations, we asked about all their practices with regard to external dependencies or supply chain risk management, right? And then the next section in the assessment is, okay, what governance practices do you have in place to make sure that this is sustained in the organization? Policy, management oversight, higher level oversight, which in a private company, that's frequently the board, right? Measurement, making sure that the activities adhere to the plan. I guess it's intuitive, but if you look at some of these results, where they have things like planning, management oversight, and measurement of effectiveness, they're more likely to have a higher degree of process. They're more likely to have all the practices in place that you want to see and to sustain those. So I would say if you're in a government organization and you're dealing with contractors around something like CDI, some of the questions are, well, do you really have a policy for this that affects the whole organization, right? Do people in the organization know about this? How, and this is a hard activity, but it's worthwhile, how are you measuring the effectiveness of that? Do you have some specific quantitative measures in place so that so that you know how you're doing? And again, is there oversight? Okay, so there is I should put out that there is a capability assessment relating to the DFARS and covered defense information. It's out now. I was one of the people that helped create it. It's relatively rough, right? Like it's not a formal tool, but it's something that we think can help, and it's also completely available. It's one of the things we think can help contractors and people dealing with these issues in the supply chain to understand their capability and to do a better job around this. And it will also, if an organization fills this out, it will also provide some of the resources and ways to improve capability in this area. So if anyone's interested, I mean, I'm really looking for feedback on it, right? Because it's we're in the early stages of developing this. We think it would be useful for folks in the defense community. I'm looking for feedback on it. Is this something practical? Do you think it would work in your organization? Do you think it would help people, right? It exists now as an Excel spreadsheet, but please, feel free to approach me afterward, and I'm happy to share it, and we can talk about it more. One of the other things, if we're thinking about the understanding an organization's kind of enterprise-level capability, how do you manage this? Or if you're a prime contractor and you're thinking about how do all my subcontractors manage this, right? Do I know what they're really doing, other than, yes, they're signing the contract maybe, but do I really know what they're doing? One approach to that is an assessment like the CRR or a capability assessment. In addition, you can also look at using the Nist cybersecurity framework and using that as a way for a set of contractors or subcontractors to kind of exchange notes about this area. And it actually kind of says that in the NIST 800-171 publication itself. It more or less says one way to approach this is look at the controls, they map to 853, and all of the 853 controls map back to the NIST cybersecurity framework. Now, that requires a little work. There's not a handy tool that exists for this yet. But we really support the NIST cybersecurity framework. It's another tool that can be used to understand your capability in this area. So this is kind of a sum-up slide, I suppose. Traditional contractor or third-party management versus a more resilient approach. Traditionally, and these are obviously blanket generalizations, of course. Traditionally, the focus is on contract requirements, using the legal instrument as a means to drive behavior and allocate risk, which is important, but basically it should be considered one part of the solution, right? At least for a certain tier of contracts or a certain level of contracts that are of critical importance to the organization, right? Traditionally, I think in a lot of organizations, there's vendor management and contractor management. Maybe it involves the right folks. Frequently it does. A resilient approach is the right stakeholders have input into that process at the right time. I mean, anyone who's been in information security for any length of time, the different sectors and industries are replete with examples where contracts goes and forms a company and never asks the information security guys, can those people really do what we need them to do to protect our information, right? In a resilient organization, the right people are involved to make sure that actually happens. Traditionally, there are assessments, but they might be at a single point in time. A more resilient solution is, hey, this is continuously managed, and when we assess an organization, we also try to get a better understanding of, will they continue to do this over time? Do they have the governance in place to make sure that this activity is done over time? So what are we suggesting here? Kind of the nutshell. Contract requirements are not enough for hard supply chain problems and for really critical relationships. I mean, a basic process in any organization is, well, let's look at our third parties and let's tier them, or our contractors. The tier 3 folks, maybe we don't need to pay as much attention to those. But the tier 1 folks and the critical folks, a contract requirement is probably not going to be enough, right? The specific controls and technology are really important. They're just one component. We talked about enterprise governance. And I also think, and to be honest with you, even though I'm a former Army guy, in terms of what this looks like in the defense community, this is just kind of my pitch. I think if we were able to foster a climate where information about capabilities, what's the organization really doing, where that was a little more forthcoming and where organizations could really share that information, we'd all be a little bit better for it. Because if you think about the CRR and you kind of think about the backdrop of the Cyber Resilience Review, one of the biggest factors here is the law, protected critical infrastructure information. So when we go in to assess somebody, we can say with a pretty high degree of certainty, your information is yours. We're going to ask you a lot of probing questions about what you do security-wise, and that information is protected. It's not going anywhere else. It's not going to go for regulatory use, and so on and so forth. So I think that kind of, call it safe harbor, but that kind of understanding. I know there's a lot of sharing that goes on now about things like incident information and threat information. If that extended to enterprise management and organizational management so that stakeholders had that level of understanding, I think we'd be a lot better for it. I don't know how to do that, but it's just my pitch based on the experience of my team on the kind of civilian and critical infrastructure side. Well, that's it. What questions, I don't know if we're short or long or how we're looking here, but what questions do folks have? Okay. I mean, what challenges have folks, for folks dealing with contracts, what challenges have you experienced in this area? Please. Right. And so for the sake of the room, the gentleman's comment was that in many organizations, it is siloed, and you go back and you might fix things with a contractor, but in terms of selecting the contracts and vendor management, getting those people aboard, there's not enough thinking about information security up front. And I mean, this is really common. I would say that some sectors, some industries do a better job than others. Actually, I spent this past week assessing a small government organization based on like a critical infrastructure service. This is exactly the case. This is what they do. We have contract and procurement folks. They're over there we have what we're given. If there's a problem, if there's a breach or something, well, we got to fix it, but we had no say up front. It's a basic takeaway. I mean, if you're going to rely on somebody, information and communications technology supports everything, so that has to be part of the process. Okay, well, if you have any questions afterward, please see me. Again, we're always looking for organizations to participate in the CRR. It's free. Your information is protected. You get a benchmark against 252 other organizations, and you also get, it also tracks back to, or it provides information about what an organization can do to improve. So I hope this was helpful, and thanks for your time.
Thanks. Before we close out, I'd like to mention we have a related session tomorrow morning, same location, same time, and it will get into the Deforest rule and Nist in protecting what is protected defense information.
Cool.
So it should be, if you're interested in this, you might want to come back for that session. Over to you.
Thank you. So, John, a great topic. More to learn, right? And questions for John. And thanks, FCO, for having the training sessions for you. Thanks to the folks who give their time and their knowledge back to you. So take advantage. And the next session starts, I think, around 9:45. It's in your program. Come back, and we'll be here twice today with more training. Thank you again. If you're a CEU, your badge goes to the back to see Sheila. Yeah, the next session's 10:45.